Let's jump right in. We're taking a trip back to August 2018, straight into the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Picture this, it's the 24th World Congress of Philosophy. We're talking a massive gathering of the greatest thinkers on the entire planet. But right in the middle of this incredibly prestigious global summit, a completely unorthodox, radical text drops. It was submitted by an author named Xuefeng. And in this explainer, we are going to unpack this fascinating, highly provocative document. Now look, we aren't here to endorse these views, but rather to break down the sheer audacity of his arguments, step by step, using the exact claims he laid out.
To really get what Xuefeng is doing here, we have to start with the prompt itself. The chairman of the International Federation of Philosophical Societies, Professor Dermot Moran, stood up at the opening ceremony and raised 4 massive existential questions about the fate of humanity. These were definitely not easy questions. And as you'll see, Xuefeng's startling, unconventional answers completely flipped them on their head.
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the 4 questions: man and society, AI and survival, the superhuman philosophy, pure human nature, and we'll wrap up with a challenge to masters.
Starting off with Section 1, the 4 philosophical questions. So, here are the 4 profound prompts that Professor Moran delivered to the crowd. First, is the relationship between man and society one or many? Second, facing AI, what exactly is the future of mankind? Third, do we face problems with a critical eye or by seeking verification? And finally, is learning to be human for oneself or for others? Now, as we examine Xuefeng's framework, keep this in mind. He relies heavily on a sort of intellectual bait and switch. For almost every single question, he completely rejects the binary premise it's built on. It's fascinating.
Moving on to Section 2, Man, Society, and Combination. Remember that first prompt? It asked if the relationship is one or many. Well, Xuefeng immediately deploys this rhythmic rule of 3 contrast. His text argues that the relationship is strictly not one, and it's strictly not many. He completely rejects the concept of the individual and the concept of the many entirely, opting instead for a really startling third option to define human existence.
So the crucial point here is his concept of combination. Xuefeng posits that the relationship is actually a synthesis. He argues that the individual and the whole are inherently tied together, kind of like cells in a human body. Think about it. If the body perishes, the cells die. But without cells, there's no body. He even makes this wild claim that if there were literally only 3 people left on Earth, they would constitute a society, and a single person absolutely must, combine with that tiny society, or they'll inevitably face extinction. It's a really heavy thought, right? That total reliance on the collective is the only way forward.
To illustrate this logic, Xuefeng leans into a super vivid biological analogy. He argues that humans operate on the exact same biological rules as a hive or a pack. Basically, when looking at human society from a higher level of life, he states there is absolutely no fundamental difference between our society and an ant colony, a bee swarm, or a pack of wolves. You are part of the combination, or, well, you just don't survive.
Okay, let's jump to Section 3, AI and human survival.
When looking at current global civilizations, I gotta say, Xuefeng's prognosis is incredibly grim. He predicts the path of American civilization is going to become narrower. He declares Chinese civilization to be an absolute dead end, and he asserts that the integration of political and religious civilization in Middle Eastern countries will inevitably decline. He basically leaves no modern system standing.
So why is he so grim about all our current systems? 2 letters, AI. Xuefeng issues a really stark warning here. He writes that intelligent technology is just unstoppable, and it's eventually going to spawn biological robots that are way more advanced than humans. He even predicts that natural, mother-led human reproduction will be completely replaced by what he calls biochemical nursery rooms run by these robots. His conclusion is brutal and honestly sounds straight out of a dystopian sci-fi film. He says that as long as there is competition, human beings will be entirely eliminated by biological robots. No way around it.
So what's his answer to this impending doom? Well, he claims there is only one way to survive the AI apocalypse, and that is to adopt what he specifically calls a Xuefeng-style communist society. According to his text, mankind is completely bound to perish unless it adopts this exact, singular system of production and life to eliminate competition before the machines take over.
That brings us to Section 4, the superhuman philosophy.
Now, think back to the third question from the World Congress. How should humanity face its problems, with criticism or by seeking verification? Now, what's really interesting about this is how Xuefeng once again rejects both options entirely. He argues that criticism is completely useless because it only finds problems but can't actually solve them. But he also rejects verification. He uses a pretty vivid metaphor here, comparing verification to crossing a river by feeling the stones. He argues this is just way too risky. You could easily be overturned by a rogue wave and drown before you even reach the center of the river.
Since he rejects both criticism and verification, he defines a third option, which he calls the superhuman philosophy. Xuefeng proposes that humanity must be guided by a completely selfless and supremely intelligent figure, a saint, as he puts it. This singular figure would do all the analysis, all the judgment, and induction, and they would point out the exact way forward for the rest of humanity.
To justify this, he makes a really bold, highly controversial claim. He states, and I quote, "The collective wisdom of millions of mediocrities is not as good as the foresight and sagacity of a saint. Democracy is the pursuit of mediocrities, and democracy cannot solve the problem of directionality." Let that sink in. It's a radical, incredibly provocative argument that completely dismisses collective governance in favor of absolute, singular guidance.
All right, Section 5, Pure Human Nature.
Let's tackle the fourth and final question posed by the chairman. Is learning to be human for oneself or for others? Once again, we see his signature rejection of the binary. He argues that learning to be human is neither for oneself, nor is it for others. He thinks framing human existence around who gets the benefit is entirely the wrong approach.
Instead, he introduces what we can call the computer analogy. Xuefeng believes that learning to be human is actually about returning to pure human nature, which he defines as a nature that simply conforms to the way of nature. He visualizes this by comparing a human to a computer. Think of it like this. If you build a computer that performs really well, it works perfectly no matter who is using it. But, he argues, if you specifically try to manufacture it just for yourself, others can't use it. If you try to make it for others, its raw performance is greatly reduced. Therefore, human nature should just be about optimal, natural performance, completely devoid of selfish or selfless intentions.
And finally, Section 6, a challenge to masters.
This brings us to the final part of our explainer, where Xuefeng shifts from answering the questions to directly addressing the global philosophy community gathered at the summit. He notes that there are thousands of professional and amateur philosophers sitting right there in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. He calls them all masters in the philosophical world today. And rather than just quietly submitting his paper for peer review, he concludes his text by directly and openly challenging every single one of those thousands of attendees.
He ends with a truly staggering claim, saying, "I, Xuefeng, am willing to challenge the masters. That is, I can solve all the philosophical problems that you cannot solve. Do you not believe me? Bring your problem to me and see how I will solve it." Talk about an incredibly audacious way to cap off a highly unconventional text, right? So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. When faced with the existential threats of AI, societal collapse, and human nature, do the real answers lie in democratic verification or in the radical, systemic overhauls proposed in texts like this one? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into this explainer, and keep questioning everything.